Hi, welcome to Coach Clover's Classroom, and today we're going to be talking about imperialism. Now, imperialism is ultimately about establishing your control or power over someone else through a sphere of influence, saying they are going to be underneath your sphere and you'll have power over because they are within it. So, while the US is going through some political turmoil in the Gilded Age and Reconstruction, the European nations have decided to stop fighting each other for once and to start looking elsewhere for new territories. Places being Africa, Asia, the Middle East. The countries will get together in what's known as the Berlin Conference and start establishing where they are going to expand their imperial control. So, without inviting any African, Middle Eastern, or Asian countries, they begin to do so. The United States is starting to feel like they are a world power after having interactions with Japan and forcing Japan's markets open to the American economy. And so we start looking overseas at acquiring territories. Now, one of the big problems with the United States in acquiring territory is that we are surrounded on both sides by a giant ocean. The United States has the Atlantic on one side and the Pacific on another. So along comes Alfred Thayer Mahan, a famous admiral who draws influence from the British defeating Napoleon, and says in order for the US to be a superpower, we need a powerful navy. Not only do we need a powerful navy, we need many naval bases around the world to fuel our ships that are powered by coal. One of these bases that we begin eyeing is the island of Hawaii. Hawaii originally settled by the native Hawaiians and later by American farmers in the 1800s. A man by the name of Stanford B. Dole, yes, Dole from Dole Pineapple, convinces the Queens to give the American farmers voting rights. Once the Queen agrees, a few short years later, they feel that it is threatening to American farmers, and the American planters overthrow the Queen and establish it as a territory for the United States. Now, with Hawaii under U.S. control, we start looking overseas even further about reaching Japan, China. And there's a little knock on the back door, this being the island of Cuba. Cuba begins a rebellion against the King of Spain. Cuba fighting for its independence against the Spanish. The Spanish will commit many atrocities of rounding up civilians, putting them in detention camps and mass concentration camps. The Spanish will begin a ruthless campaign against the Cubans. Being so close to the United States, Cuba has a sweet spot in the American heart. So the U.S. decides to support the Cuban Revolution. First through the dollar, buying Cuban rum, putting it in popular drinks like rum and Coke, being a Cuba Libre, a free Cuba. The U.S. will then dispatch the USS Maine off the coast of Havana to show our support for the Cuban rebels. What could possibly go wrong? 2 days after its arrival, at the midnight hour, the USS Maine exploded. The U.S. journalists declare that it's an attack from Spain, and through a campaign of yellow journalism, tinting journalism one way to suit and try and get a political agenda done, the U.S. follows this and blames Spain for the attack. Congress will then shortly declare war on Spain, and after a few short months and not many casualties in the large scheme of things, the United States will emerge victorious by defeating Spain in Cuba, but also on the West Coast. Admiral Dewey will defeat the Spanish and go and sail to the Philippines to defeat the Spanish there. Now, many famous people are going to be involved in the Spanish-American War. One of these that we most commonly known is Teddy Roosevelt, famously portrayed by Robin Williams in Night of the Living Museum. Yes, Teddy Roosevelt quits his office, forms the Rough Riders, and will travel to Cuba to fight for Cuban independence. With the charge up San Juan Hill, Teddy Roosevelt claims a spot in American immortality and the idea that this is what American manhood should represent. He becomes a national war hero. When he returns to the United States, he'll become elected the governor of New York and then vice president. And after McKinley is assassinated, as we've already discussed, Roosevelt will become a progressive president of the United States. It's not uncommon for war heroes to become president in America. George Washington, for example, Theodore Roosevelt, Dwight Eisenhower, all famous soldiers who achieved that fame in war. So, with the United States ending the war against Spain, the splendid little war, the U.S. decides that we will grant Cuba its independence. There are a few other territories the U.S. got as well, this being the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Guam. The U.S. decides that the Philippines cannot be given back to Spain because that would be cowardly and all those Americans would have died for nothing. We cannot give it to France or Germany because we are competing against them economically in our pursuit of getting to the Chinese markets. Lastly, the Philippines cannot be independent on their own as they are not ready. And so McKinley says that it came to him that the U.S. shall retain the Philippines indefinitely as a territory, and I shall sleep soundly, he said. Cuba receiving its independence would only happen if they accepted the Platt Amendment, this giving the U.S. a permanent Big Brother status in Cuba, making us their protector and granting us our naval base at Guantanamo Bay. Now, naturally, as you can imagine, Cuba getting its independence and us being good friends did not sit well over in the Philippines. Emilio Aguinaldo will begin a campaign of trying to get the U.S. to grant the Philippines its independence. When the U.S. constantly says no, the Philippines will ultimately revolt against the United States in a bloody 4-year war that leaves thousands of people dead. The U.S. colonial admin team overlooking the Philippines does make an effort to modernize, bringing in paved roads, railroads, agricultural machines, teachers, hospitals, telegraphs, and electricity in an effort to make it modernized. However, most Americans realize that the Philippines was just a stepping stone to something further beyond. So, what is the role of the U.S. in all of this? And how are these people going to be treated? So, with no former territories previously, the U.S. passes the Four Acre Act, giving Puerto Rico a status of insular territory, gave everyone their U.S. citizenship. They weren't able to participate in elections, but they could vote and had to follow the laws. After the Philippine-American War, the Philippines would get the same status. Guam, with just its few hundred inhabitants at the time, would be titled as an unincorporated territory. So what is the role of the U.S.? Are we a republic? Are we an empire? Can we stand up for liberty and freedom, but still be a colonizer and imperialistic? Some argue that it was crushing by not granting the Philippines its independence. Others said that we needed to uplift their culture, spread liberty, and Christianize them. And that was the mission of the United States. But everyone could agree on one thing. The Philippines wasn't the end. The U.S. had recently passed the open door policy, which ensured China had to trade and keep its borders open to European nations and European merchants. European nations looked at controlling China through monetary means by controlling their economy, setting up cities. And so the Chinese will rebel to what people in the West know as the Boxer Rebellion, killing off Europeans and American merchants angers the admin at the time, and they send 20,000 troops to put down the rebellion. John Hay ensures the U.S. that China will remain open for business. Isn't it amazing that we made another country, forced another country to stay open so we could make money off of them? Now, Panama is something that we haven't talked about just yet, but it's one of the few things we do need that we have left. Alfred Thayer Mahan realizes that it takes a long while to sail around South America. And so the easiest way to do it would be to build a canal somewhere across North America, preferably at the thinnest point. Teddy Roosevelt begins to eye the Isthmus of Panama while he's in political office. He asks Colombia for Panama to be granted its independence and for Panama to build the canal. They would even go so far as to support a Colombian president if the U.S. could do this. Colombia, of course, said no. And so the U.S., led by President Roosevelt, helped spark a Panamanian revolution, and that the U.S. would back the Panamanian rebels as long as the U.S. granted control of the Panama Canal. So while the canal was built by immigrant labor after the Panamanians got their independence, it was finished just in time for the U.S. entrance into World War I, and the U.S. will retain Panama Canal up until the 70s when President Carter agreed to give Panama Canal back to Panama in the year 2000. This was vastly unpopular in the 1970s and remained unpopular up into the modern day. So while Roosevelt's taking the Panama Canal was a sign of clear U.S. imperialism, he also pushed the issue that the U.S. was the beat cop of the Western Hemisphere, that it was the policeman, the judge, and executioner of the Western Hemisphere, of North and South America. Using the Monroe Doctrine as his backing, he declared that no European power had influence in North or South America, and that we were an international policeman. This would be seen as we ordered troops into the Dominican Republic, to Haiti, to Cuba, to Nicaragua, and Honduras to put down rebellions, collect debts, and set up American businesses, ultimately to protect American businesses and interest. When Roosevelt leaves office, many people are thankful, as it seems conflict will go away. President Taft, on the other hand, still continues the imperialistic policies, but decides that it is better not to put a gun in someone's face and tell them you have to do this, but instead to use the American dollar as a way to intervene, to grant one economic power and imperialism and ownership over a smaller nation by using a stronger economy. This is what will become known as dollar diplomacy. So the U.S. and imperialism, it's less about obtaining colonies and more about getting U.S. materials to make goods, but more importantly, and most importantly, opening up new markets for the U.S. to sell goods and products. That's all for this time. Thank you for tuning in to Coach Cloker's Classroom. Until next time, I love you, I'm proud of you, and don't do nothing illegal. Thank you.